put a samurai sword to my throat. As he opened the door, rushed forward and bang, there's a sword to my throat, and I felt the cold steel in my throat. And his face was blood red, really angry, and he's shouting at me, and saliva's hitting me as he's screaming at me, "You're drug squad, you're DS, I know you are."
Hi, I'm Zach, Investigations Editor at The Express. You're watching On the Edge. I've got with me today Neil Woods, who was a police officer, undercover police officer for 14 years, was it?
I worked undercover over that period of time, yeah.
And now he's an activist for the legal control of drugs. Correct? Did I get it right?
That's right.
Okay.
Good to see you, Zach.
Yes, nice to meet you. So, I guess we'll kick it like, whereabouts are you from? You're from Derbyshire, right?
I grew up in Derbyshire. That was my original constabulary, yes.
Yeah. And like, I think from what I've read or listened to, you kind of joined the police by accident, was it?
Yeah, well, I went to university by mistake. And I found myself in a lecture, listening to a lecture on business studies, wondering why on earth I ever thought I was going to be interested in that. Yeah. So I left university and I was wondering what to do. Much to the dismay of my parents at the time, as you can imagine. And I was going to go on an adventure backpacking around Europe with some friends, because that's what they'd done. They'd gone travelling and doing fruit picking and things like that, just for a year or so. But then I saw an advertisement for the police in the local newspaper, the Books and Advertiser. So I thought, well, that, it'd be different. So I couldn't make my mind up, so I flipped a coin. And it came up heads, which meant that I applied for the police.
And what, you kind of gave them a chance. Did you like it straight away? How did you?
Well, very quickly, with that uniform on, I realised how young I was. Yeah. And I hadn't realised how young I was until that point. And the fact that I'd grown up in a fairly sheltered, quiet town, the town of Buxton in the Peak District. And I struggled, I really did. I was 19. I was a young 19, so I discovered. And I wasn't naturally good at the job. So, no, if I'm honest, I struggled with it and I hated it. And in fact, for the first 2 years, I only stayed in really just to prove to myself I could get through the first 2 years and actually get qualified.
Yeah. And so was there a point that it shifted or like?
Yeah, well, I got past the 2 years. I was doing a bit better. And then I managed to get moved from Derby in the south of the county to Glossop in the north of the county, which borders Greater Manchester. And I suppose a sort of change of scene allowed me to reset myself, if that makes sense. You quite often, particularly in an organisation like police, you carry the baggage of your first impressions, the first impressions you've made on people. So making a fresh start, being able to make a new impression on people, allowed me some freedom, and I developed a lot quicker then. And it was much better. I still wouldn't consider myself a star uniform cop by any means, but 4 years service in early 1993, I got an attachment to the drug squad. Just a month's attachment.
Wait, is this in Glossop?
It's in Glossop, but the drug squad was county-wide.
Okay.
So there were 2 officers at the time, one in Chesterfield, one in Derby. And I got an attachment to the Chesterfield drug squad office, but only for a month. And this was a strange thing. These attachments hadn't really happened before. But the reason that they were happening is because at that moment in time, in 1993, I doubt many listeners will remember what this was like. But in 1993, there was a real moral panic about drugs. And you're a journalist, you know about moral panics. There's always a new moral panic about drugs on the horizon, right? Well, in 1993, it was worse than all of them. And it was about crack cocaine in particular. And that was because tabloid newspapers, no disrespect, had been publishing stories about this horror, this horrible, horrific drug that was destroying whole communities in America called crack cocaine. And so with these constant drip of stories coming in, the British public were scared about crack cocaine for a good couple of years before we had any. So when it actually did start hitting the streets, people were, immediately responded in fear. And of course, in the UK, the crack cocaine market just sat alongside the heroin market. The public were shouting to their MPs, what are you doing about this terrible crack cocaine that's going to destroy our community, our society? Because really, that's the fear that people had. And MPs responded by saying, oh, well, we've got to do something about it. And that fed into the Home Office. And the Home Secretary made an order to all of the chief constables that you must make drugs your number one priority over everything, over terrorism, over domestic violence, or whatever other consideration. This is your number one priority. And there was more funding found, specifically for constabularies to tackle heroin and crack cocaine markets. And that's where I came in, because when the Chief Constable of Derbyshire was instructed by the Home Secretary, do something about it, well, the Chief thinks, well, what am I going to do? I know. I'll try and spread the expertise of the drug squad to some young rookies. We'll arrange to give them attachments and try and, encourage young cops to get stuck into the drug markets. And that's how I got attached to the drug squad, really. It was a quirk of the political situation at the time. But the drug squad hated having us rookies there. They did. I mean, we didn't know what we were doing. I didn't know how to do surveillance and complex covert investigations, and we were getting under their feet. But then one of them, a guy called Paul Wood, who was a brilliant cop, actually, he said to me one day, looked at me strangely and said, do you fancy having a go at buying some crack cocaine? I thought, well, it's not what I was expecting, but, I'll have a go. So the next thing I knew, we'd gone to the South office in Derby. I'm working with them, and I was given a £20 note, sent to this address and knocked on the door. And this huge guy answered the door and looked down at me and said, what do you want? Who are you? You're not a student, are you? I hate students. And at that moment, I thought, actually, I don't know who I am. I've got no idea, because no one told me I needed a cover story. I was just told take this £20 note and go knock on that door. So I quickly thought, well, that'll do. I'll tell him I'm a student. So I said, yeah, I'm a student. And he says, are you stupid? I've just told you I hate students. But he laughed. He found it funny. And in no time at all, he was opening his palm and there was loads of little paper twists. He let me choose which one I was going to have. And he thought I was rather cheeky, actually, undoing it and checking it as well. But eventually, paid him the £20 note. And as I was walking away, he said, hey, you take care now. Don't get yourself arrested. Which I thought was nice, actually, nice and considerate of him. But I suppose the thing to take away from that, really, is that it was pretty easy, really. I hadn't had that much preparation. I literally just knocked on this guy's door, right? But that's because they didn't see that tactic coming, because this was new. Now, I'm not saying we invented undercover work. Undercover work's been going on since a long time. Particular types of undercover work in the UK since 1968. But this was new in the UK in the terms of it being at low level, with the intention of hitting at the street level and seeing what we could find out. But the thing is, in this backdrop of pressure to respond to this moral panic, this really made the eyes light up of the supervision of the drug squad, because this was a simple way of getting much bigger results and take the pressure off, right? So in no time at all, I was being developed, so to speak, and I was being loaned out to other drug squads in different counties. And it seemed like no time at all I'd gone from doing a few days operation to a few weeks, and then in no time at all I was doing no less than 6 or 7 months being loaned out.
Just to go back, so it was Chesterfield that you were started working in, or was it? What was the kind of crack and heroin situation at that time? Was it?
Well, the significant heroin and crack markets that they had intelligence about were in Derby. Okay. So we went down to Derby and we worked together with the Derby team for that operation.
Okay. And what happened with the guy that you knocked on the door? Did that deliver the result that they wanted?
He was a significant target. The operation went on a bit longer. I had more purchases from him and other people. I bought off some people in a bookmakers, and Eventually there were raids done. There was lots of people arrested. I remember one person, one of the targets jumped out of a window and broke his ankle. It was quite a short-term job, but there was many people arrested from it.
How did you feel about it at the time? Was it like, did you feel the rush of like having done something of like, is that something that developed, or like, well, how did you feel towards it?
Well, I mean, it took me a little while to get into it, a few attempts, but I suppose I quite quickly got into the flow of things, and bearing in mind that I was used to just getting by, right, in my job, just trying to learn and as fast as other people, just trying to develop and keep my head above water and keep my job. To suddenly I found myself very quickly developing in something that I actually felt a natural ability for. And that was a real contrast, after all the pressure of being really quite crap at being a uniformed cop. This was something I took to very quickly. And to answer your question, I enjoyed that. And I very quickly learnt how to adapt to situations, to dangerous situations. And that was exhilarating, quite frankly. It was exhilarating. It was exhilarating to sort of develop this art of lying and to maintain a lie and to maintain a lie in increasingly complex situations. It's a real mental challenge. And it's a mental challenge that I took to and seemed to suit my personality.
Talk me through in terms of like your process. Do you think of everything beforehand, or do you is it more about responding in that moment and having the answers appear to you? How do you do it?
Well, by that question, you've actually hit on probably the most important thing about undercover work, is that it's all responding in the moment with no preparation. So obviously you can go, you can have a plan, you have a briefing at the start of the day, you know who the targets are, you know what the aim is, you know what the strategy is there, and you form a strategy in your head in terms of how you're going to engage with this community, and I might have some sort of stock words that I might use to go into a group of people and say, hello, ways of saying hello. But in terms of responding to what comes, that has to be in the moment. And that is probably the most important thing to understand about being successful within undercover work. There is no preparation for getting through those moments successfully, none. And in fact, it's the difference between acting and working undercover. Because I don't have the skills of an actor. I don't think I ever could. These people who work very hard to study drama and they learn a script and they'll do it on a stage or they'll do it on a film set. They've learnt it. I'd struggle to do that. Because undercover work isn't acting. It's being a different version of yourself. And that relies on authenticity and existing in that moment so that it's clear to everyone else you're existing in that moment. The undercover operative who tries to act will fail.
Were there any moments where you'd done something and then you kind of realised what you were doing? But maybe earlier in your career where you were kind of like, oh, I responded to that and I handled that situation and that. What are some of the examples that you remember?
Well, I suppose there's the dangerous situations. I've been doing it for about 3 years, maybe 3.5 years, something like that, when I did an operation in what is now my closest city, my home city, Stoke-on-Trent. And I'd been buying heroin off this dealer for quite a while, and I thought we were good mates. I thought we were getting on okay. And I remember I went to his door one day, and it was in Fenton, and it was one of these sort of 2 up, 2 down, really old pottery workers, cottage like terrace houses, where the steps would go up to the front door. So someone opens the front door and you're looking up to them. Anyway, I knocked on this door one day and he put a samurai sword to my throat. As he opened the door, rushed forward and bang, there's a sword to my throat, and I felt the cold steel on my throat. And his face was blood red, really angry, and he's shouting at me, and saliva's hitting me as he's screaming at me, "You're drug squad, you're DS, I know you are." And I remember just feebly saying something along the lines of, "Oh, not meaning to stress you out, man. You know, just like chill." Thinking, please don't cut my throat. But then a woman sort of stuck her head out from behind him and she started laughing. She says, "I thought he was going to say he was then." And then the two of them started laughing. So they were having me on. Or he was just wanting to try out his new sword, maybe. Or just part of the sort of layers of intimidation and reputation building that heroin dealers feel that they have to do. So then I had to calmly negotiate with him what I wanted. And I wanted half a tea, a particular weight. And he says, "I haven't got anything near that." So I had to sort of work out the mathematics of purchasing, having a bulk buy of smaller amounts and so there was a bit of maths to work out. Anyway, I bought 4 £10 deals and I'm walking away, putting those in a cigarette packet, and I look up and there's a knife pointing towards my stomach, this sort of black-handled kitchen knife. A guy's trying to rob me for the heroin I'd just bought. And I thought, and I knew what was behind me, so I started trotting back really quickly. And so he's trying to come after me. And, you know, he said the funniest thing. He said, no, mate, just come here a minute. I'm thinking, no, just come here a minute. You just tried to rob me at knife point. So anyway, I managed to get around the side of a car. And, you know, as a kid, you used to play like running around a car and someone trying to chase you. It was a bit like that. It was a really ridiculously comic situation. But eventually he ran out of steam and I ran away and got away. And I remember afterwards just reviewing it in my head and my responses. And I remember being really smug because I was, 27 at that point. I was really pleased with myself because as a young man, you think, wow, I'm the kind of person who can cope with that stuff, right? And, you know, all my colleagues going like, wow, you know, why do you look so chilled out? And how can you just brush that off? You've just been through all this. And I thought, yeah, that's really pleasing, and it really boosted my ego as a young man. It really did. But to answer your question, I was reviewing my responses, and I have to say I was pleased with my responses. I was pleased that I could really, throughout the whole thing, I stayed completely calm.
And then did you just realise that you were one of those people that when that situation happened, like that you, because obviously that's how people respond to danger. Like some people, they fly away from it, and other people, they become calmer. Is that just something you leaned into, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, that is something I realised. I realised that my responses to dangerous situations, in my responses, I had an advantage. And so I discussed this with other people, with some of the level 1 undercover people who I spoke to and got advice from. And it seems that a minority of people have a different response to adrenaline. So, for example, when I was under threat and, you know, I had a risky situation, you get that surge of adrenaline, you know, so you have that fight or flight situation. You know, you get you feel the urge to bounce on your legs because all the blood's rushing to your legs to escape or fight. My brain went really calm and gave me the sensation that I had all the time in the world to think. So I actually had a physical sort of a feeling of time slowing down, and that it's okay, I've got time to think. And that was what happened to me. And that's an advantage, right? If you can feel that you've got all the time in the world to think. And that happened to me many times. And possibly that's to do with personality. I'm not the natural personality to go into policing. And I didn't necessarily react to some things as a uniform cop as well as others. But working undercover, thinking on my own, thinking on my feet, it suited me very much.
Mm. And when you were like, you had obviously specific stuff that you were doing. So you were going in and like buying a certain amount of drugs and this type of thing. How often, or I imagine it happened a lot, that you would then encounter something that was completely left field, that was potentially a crime or a difficult situation? Like, what are some of the things that you saw, and then how do you handle that as you're an undercover policeman, you've seen something that maybe you need to report, or that there is, you know, a worry about?
Well, I suppose in answering that question, I should say that as a police officer, your duty remains the same, right? Just because you're working undercover, that duty doesn't change. And the first duty is the preservation of life. So sometimes that first duty has been uncomfortable because in order to respond to something, it might mean that I would have to break cover. And the golden rule undercover is you don't break cover. You don't ever show out, ever, no matter the pressure, because that's going to be the thing that puts you under most danger. And you've also got to think about the operation, right? But I've seen people assaulted, and having been involved as a detective in things like one-punch manslaughters, you know, things can go wrong very quickly from even a small amount of violence. I've had some uncomfortable moments. So, for example, there was an operation where I was infiltrating this pub in the village of Chiswick in Leicestershire. Now, this was an extraordinary place. It was absolutely bizarre because it was a village pub, right? Very attractive looking village pub in the sort of centre point between Nottingham, Leicester and Derby. And it happened to be the meeting point of gangsters from those three cities. It was just because it was like a sort of caricatured place, you know. It would have looked over the top in a graphic novel, you know. It was ridiculous. All of these, one of the main targets for the operation was an antique burglar who was also involved in thousands and thousands of pounds worth of stolen cars, like every day. He was this extraordinary criminal, but also dealing smaller amounts. He was just pitched at every level. And one day, when I was getting to know him, and he was a bit like a comic book type gangster because he was this figure, but he had hench people around him. And this guy came up to him and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I still owe you that tenner." And he gave a nod to his henchman, and like that. So the henchman went up to this guy and punched him and knocked him on the floor. I thought, wow, he's not getting up. But that was done without a word, over a £10 debt. Wow. And that was the kind of atmosphere in there. But of course, I'm thinking, well, I can't, you know, if I show out now, I'm in significant trouble. So I'm thinking, I'm looking where the ashtray is, so I can throw the ashtray through the front window if I need to, because that I would be safer if I did that, if I had to show out. And also it would be a way of getting help. And I'm thinking about all these things and these strategies, and then I see the guy starting to move. Just as I'm thinking he needs first aid, then he gets up. He's all right. But that was one of those moments where I was sort of faced with, what is my duty at this point, and how long do I leave it before I have to behave in an entirely different way?
How often would that happen on every job? There'd be moments like that? No,
there wasn't that many really. I saw all the crimes happening and burglaries happening, but the burglary doesn't matter. You just record what happened, but violence towards people or vulnerabilities of people had to be considered.
How did you? Because you've touched on it a few times about like you building the relationship. How did that affect you in terms of your feelings of? Because it's hard to like not naturally start to like someone or build a rapport, even if it is that you're doing it for a different purpose.
Well, it depends on who it was, because the main targets of the investigation, I had no problem manipulating those people. But for the majority of the operations that I did, it was moving amongst the street population of a city centre, right? So the vulnerable people. Yeah. And I realised very early on that to be successful and to get introductions to the sort of regional managers, the people that were worth gathering evidence on, I would have to mingle with and be part of that sort of street community. People who were homeless, living in squats, or on the edge of that sort of demographic. And there's two reasons for that. One is that people on those kind of situations are the people who are using drugs problematically. That's what's got them in that situation. But also because those vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate. They are. And if that sounds ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. That's the nature of undercover work, is that it's ruthless. So when I was getting to know the vulnerable people who I was intending to manipulate, I was learning a lot about them. And in fact, learning about people who were struggling with problematic drug use was the most useful thing I could do, because if I wanted to behave like them, I had to understand them. To understand them, I had to empathise with them. Right? I had to have conversations and learn about them. And I quickly realised that for the first part of my life, had complete misunderstanding about problematic drug use, complete misunderstanding. I believed the old trope that people addicted to, say, heroin or crack cocaine were just people who were stupid enough to have tried it and didn't have the willpower to get out of it. Wrong. That's not the situation at all. All of the people I was meeting were self-medicating for childhood trauma. They all had a story, every single one of them. And in learning about their story, I understood them, and I understood all the better how I needed to portray myself within that marketplace. So I got to know a lot of vulnerable people, and to go back to your question, there were some people I got quite fond of. There were some really nice people. I met some smart people who were just struggling with childhood trauma. They were self-medicating. And there was one chap in particular, Cammy, in Nottinghamshire. I picked him out to manipulate him because he was on bail for dealing heroin for a particular gang that was of particular interest to us. He was sort of on the periphery as a user dealer for the Bestwood cartel. So I spent weeks getting to know him, and he was great company. He really was. He had this sort of really easy sense of humour. We'd be sitting in the street watching people go by, and he had this sort of quick observational wit. He was funny. He was good company. And using heroin problematically, he had been doing for a long time. His personal story was that his father had been abusive. That's what I could get out of him. I went shoplifting with him, which was great fun. It was great fun. We would take it in turns to be out lookouts. But at the end of the operation, about 7 months, again, that particular operation, he was arrested alongside everyone else. And he'd been committing offences on bail, which I'd been recording, right, in my notes at the end of the day. But when he was in the police cells, he ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, because as he told the interviewing officers, that my betrayal of him was the last straw for him. Wow. Because he thought I was his one friend in the world. Like, finally, he'd found someone he could talk to. Of course, I'm an undercover cop. I'm great at this stuff, right? I can make friends with people. I can manipulate them. I can manipulate people's emotions. And in fact, I am manipulating people's emotions to literally get them to do what I want, when I want them to. But from his point of view, I was his best mate. And so he became suicidal. He got 3.5 years in prison. I don't know what happened to him, but when I was told that, the intel officer decided to tell me that. I'm not entirely sure why, but I'm glad I do know. I'm glad I did know that. But when he told me that, it just hit me. It just gut-wrenched me, It was an horrific feeling to thought that I'd hurt another human being to that extent. It was horrific. Mm-hmm. So I actually stopped undercover work at that point. I said, no, I can't do this anymore. It's just too much. But then a few weeks later, I was myself manipulated by a DS who said, look, Woodsy, we need you to do this next job because these gangsters are even worse than the last lot. So I got manipulated back into it.
When you were, you mentioned in terms of, you would adopt certain things from, the people that you were trying to manipulate. What, I've read in other stuff, it was, physically you kind of changed, and that you'd put on a pair of, tracksuit bottoms when you'd leave the family home in the morning. Talk me through that process and, how did you, once you'd go to a different place and then kind of adopt the new persona? How did it work for you? You mentioned it's not like acting, but there must be some kind of process that you used.
Yeah, and it's an awareness of how I need to be different. Mm. And some of that is from observing other people's body language and understanding where that body language comes from, right? So if you see, for example, in a city centre, you've got 5 or 6 problematic heroin users walking very, very quickly. because a dealer has said, right, I don't want to see just the one of you, I want to see all at once, and you're going to meet me at this place, but be quick, then they'll walk quickly to that point. But they'll walk a certain way, and I could glance at them instantly, and I think I know exactly what they're doing, probably exactly how much heroin they're going to buy when they get there. And there's a certain body language to that walk, and part of it is because they're on their right, and they're withdrawing, and they want their medicine, and it means that they've got stomach cramps. It means that their shoulders are hunched. It means that they're walking quickly, but not necessarily in the way that a healthy person would do. And it's a sort of leaning forward, stiff-legged, hunched forward, stomach hurting, shoulders arched. You know, there's just a certain persona to people who are in emotional and physical pain, who are being exploited by organised crime, and, you know, you can see it. So I had to sort of understand that and put myself in the same sort of appearance.
Yeah. And so what did you then, you physically, you'd
physically adopt that pain,
yeah. And I guess because it's like they have a physical, like there's a physical reason that they're doing that. I guess you mimic it, and it's like nobody questions it, because why would anyone question that someone would be faking it?
Yeah, I was confident I fit in. And again, another trick of working undercover is being 100% confident. It's a confidence trait, right? I'm a con man. So that confidence is important, and I had it. So it's just adopting that confidence into behaviour.
How was it in terms of when you were coming home at the end of the night and having to shed it? Could you switch it off? Did it still rumble on in your head?
Well, I mean, I spent a lot of time away as well. So when I was on the plot, I would be living sometimes on the plot. Okay. Not most of the time, but then if I was finishing late and then I was coming back for a morning briefing, I wouldn't be driving home. I'd be stopping locally in a hotel, I don't know, 10 miles away or something like that, or whatever they put me up. Or I've slept in some rough places. But so occasionally I'd have to be on the plot, you know, so that I was available to answer the door in the place I said I was staying at, you know. So I spent a lot of time where I didn't go home. But when I did go home, yeah, I didn't have a problem at all. I just shed it. I could be a different person. And I used to arrange my schedule wherever possible to make sure that I could still go home on a weekend and take my kids swimming on a Sunday morning. And sometimes it felt a little bit surreal in the swimming baths when I was swimming with the kids, you know, thinking I'd been buying crack from gangsters 2 days before. But really, I didn't have much difficulty with that at all. Not at the time. Of course, if you take it together with the fact that, you know, I had this advantage and this calm, and the fact that I dealt with all these near-death experiences with calm, I dealt with it fine at the time, but it caught up with me eventually.
Yeah. Well, tell me, when did it start, and what was the trigger?
Well, I'm diagnosed now with complex PTSD and moral injury. So I've got complex post-traumatic stress, basically. And all of those...
Just moral injury, can you explain it? Just because not everyone will know that term.
Okay, so moral injury has similar symptoms to PTSD, although it can be complicated. And moral injury was first identified in soldiers returning from the Vietnam War. So it's, for PTSD, a psychiatrist will say that you have to have had a near-death experience in order to have had that post-traumatic stress, or a collection of near-death experiences, or multiple layers of trauma for complex PTSD. Moral injury is about the fact that you've caused harm to someone else. So the soldiers returning from Vietnam felt terrible that they were ordered, and they carried out orders which were against their moral code, which were against their ethical being. And that's the case for me. I did things, I pushed myself to do things and kept justifying to myself to do things which in essence were contrary to my self, my sense of self, my sense of morality. So I've repeatedly, in stressful situations, caused harm to other people.
Like what kind of things?
Well, Cami, for example, that's that point of hearing about that's not the moment of trauma that's damaged me in terms of moral injury. It's the fact that I knew I was causing him harm beforehand. I knew this. It's not something I could pretend I didn't know, because I was learning about these people. I was learning about the emotional complexity and the fact that these were traumatized people. I was learning about this all the time. And so I was becoming increasingly aware that my emotional manipulation of them was only going to cause them harm. And yet, knowing that, I took the decision to keep doing it. And that was contrary to my moral self, to my sense of self. So I've, over time, caused myself some real psychological harm. And that sits alongside the PTSD, where I've been having repeated near-death experiences and also trying to psychologically deal with that at the same time. So my brain's a bit of a mess nowadays.
Just going back to something that you mentioned before, which is the officer picking up the phone to you and saying, this gang, they're worse than the last one. Over the course of your career, what was it that you saw evolve? And I suppose also, they were responding to the techniques that you were a part of as well, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And I refer you to the first time I bought crack cocaine earlier on. That was easy, right? Because he didn't know there was undercover cops going to be likely to be knocking on his door. But organised crime adapts. Drugs organised crime will always adapt, always. And over the space of 14 years where I was working undercover, I saw that adaptation. And with every passing year, the marketplace got more and more dangerous, more and more violent. And that was in response to my presence in that marketplace, my presence and people like me, because they were adapting. Because organised crime, drugs organised crime, the people who became the most successful are the people who can sidestep police tactics, right? They can sidestep the presence of police informants, grassers, by intimidating the community. And if you're the scariest gangster and you're intimidating everyone, you're less likely to be grassed up, right? If you're the scariest gangster doing violent things and you're intimidating people, you're less likely that someone will introduce a strange face to you, an undercover to you. And so my presence in that marketplace made it more violent. And that's still going on now. Organised crime is adapting to covert techniques. It's an arms race. People refer to this as a war on drugs. It's an arms race with no end in sight and no peace treaty. It's just forever getting more violent, more dangerous. That's another thing that I suppose really taxed my brain in terms of the psychological damage for me, is that I was aware of that. I was observing that in real time, but I was pushing all of my doubts and concerns to one side because I had a job to do, right? I had a job to do, and I had a duty to catch the gangster at the end of the operation. So I pushed those doubts to one side, which again just piled the pressure onto me, and so I remember your previous question now, because you said, where did that trauma come from? When I got that phone call from the DS who said, Woodsy, we need you to do this job because these gangsters, they're even worse than the last lot. Looking back, I'm pretty sure I already had PTSD at that point. My brain was going downhill very rapidly at that point. And that's before I went into the job, which ended up being the most dangerous one I did.
Okay, so talk me through the job.
Okay, so the most dangerous one was, and the gang that he referred to as even worse than the last lot, was an infamous gang called the Burger Bar Boys. So this, I think, was 2004 when I started that operation. And less than a year before, this gang had been responsible for a very high-profile double murder, the machine gunning of two young women called Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris. And one of the targets for the operation I was about to start was supposedly the person, according to the intelligence, the person who sourced those machine guns, but was also implicated in 7 different murders in Birmingham. And the rest of the gang that I was targeting were not far off as violent. So that sort of appealed to my sense of duty, right? Because what I was told was that they'd tried to send 2 other undercovers in already to get close to them, and they'd not got close enough to gather any evidence against the main players at all. And by this point in my career, I'd sort of become, I suppose, a bit of a troubleshooter. So it makes me laugh sometimes, because with all the stuff that's happened to me, I've been quite unlucky, right? Even for people working undercover in drug markets, I've been quite unlucky with my collection of stuff that's happened to me. But then thinking about it, it's not necessarily just bad luck. It's the fact that because I was all willing to take these risks, then I created the reputation and the profile of someone who could get the job done. That meant that I got the more difficult jobs. And so with this one, what should we do? We're not getting close to them. Give Woodsy a call, So that's how I ended up doing that operation. So I got to Northampton, where they'd taken over the drug supply there, and I picked on 2 vulnerable people. I went looking for them again, knowing all too well I'd be causing them harm, but I still decided to do it. So there's the moral injury going on in my head. I'm hacking away at my own psyche as I'm doing it. Found these 2 people who were really cool people. She was self-medicating for the fact she was sexually abused as a child. And she sold the big issue. She's brilliant at selling it. She used to have the same pitch outside the Marks and Spencer's about 8 o'clock every morning. And her partner, who was self-medicating, he had this awful hip problems and chronic pain all the time. And he walked with this walking stick. He was a really good shoplifter, especially for someone with a limp. Anyway, I spent weeks getting to know them, weeks and weeks. And what I thought I needed to do was to build a really good legend, so that it felt when I could get if I could get an introduction direct to the Burger Bar boys, to the core management, then I'd have a reputation they could test, right? So I sort of traded in stolen goods, or pretended, and quite often I found out who was buying spirits, who was buying DVDs, who was buying baby clothes, kids' clothes. Turns out, if you want to go shoplifting, there's always a market for children's clothes, because they grow up so fast, don't they, right? And there's a lot of people can't afford new clothes for the kids. So I was thriving. I had a thriving trade in kids' clothes. So after about 6 weeks, I got one of these 2 to introduce me directly to the Burger Bar boys. And he took me to the snooker club in the town where they were holding court. It's where they got their headquarters. And I was directed into the gents' toilets. And the guy that was introducing me was literally physically shaking. He was actually shaking on his feet. He was that nervous about doing this introduction. And I looked at him and thought, well, that's not exactly reassuring, is it? Really? He's like shaking. You could see with his stick like that. And he was pale, completely pale, dripping sweat on his forehead. I thought, God, what's coming here? So the door opened, and this hooded figure came in, and he stood on the toilet, shut the cubicle door, and looked over the top and said, "What's this?" The moment he said that, the door burst open again, and these 4 hooded figures started walking around me. And so he's looking down and asking me questions, and every so often one of them would punch me, or I was visualising it, that one of them was headbutting me on the ear, because it was really hurting my ear, and it felt like a headbutt, but I started to doubt myself nowadays. Was it a head? Was it a punch? I don't know. Anyway, it felt like headbutts on my ear. And he just kept rephrasing the question, asking the question again. And it felt like it was going on forever. And anyway, I got to the conclusion that I'm really not getting out of here in one piece. I'm not. Because I know the calibre of these people. This doesn't feel good. Anyway, then eventually he said, "All right then, what do you want?" I said, "I'll have 1 and 1, please." Very polite, meaning I'll have a 0.4 of heroin, 0.4 of crack. Gave him my 40 quid. And we exchanged phone numbers, which shocked me at that moment that I'd got to that level so quickly. Because phone numbers, I can start getting phone data and calling him up. And he put me in his phone. So from that moment, then I started gathering evidence of conspiracy for months after that, for months and months. But, you know, every single day I was in their company buying increasing amounts of drugs or sometimes trading in stolen property and things. At no point did I feel safe at all. And I couldn't say that about any other operation I'd done. I just felt in imminent danger every single day. One day, I met up with them and they'd sort of spooked me the day before because I'd started wearing a camera. But they spooked me with a sort of way they were looking at me, the way they talked to me. I thought, I'm not going to wear the camera today. I'm really glad I didn't, because that day they took me in the back of this van, took me to what seemed to be a fairly secluded place near the racecourse, and said, right, strip. You're 5-0, man. 5-0. Strip. I thought, thank God I'm not wearing the camera. But you know, the funniest things go through your head. What used to go through my head in those adrenaline states when you sort of the time slows down. Because one of them lifted up his T-shirt and showed me a gun, self-loading pistol tucked into the top of his tracksuit bottoms, making it very, very clear I was going to do what I was told, right? But the funniest things went through my head then, because first of all, I thought, how on earth are those tracksuit bottoms holding up that gun? That was the first thing. And then another thing is, when he's saying, right, you're 5-0, man, I'm thinking, you're not old enough to have seen Hawaii 5-0. Because this is before the reboot of Hawaii 5-0. This is like a 1970s show, right? I mean, I remembered it, but I was older than him. But that's what went through my head as I'm like, yeah, taking my T-shirt off and dropping my pants. But, yeah, the strangest thoughts. I survived that, and lots of other scares during that operation. But after 7 months, I gathered evidence against everyone involved in their operation. Everyone. And I know that because there were no new phone numbers to get. There were no new names, people that were saying that I hadn't met, you know. I'd gathered evidence against everyone, the sex workers they were using to do the running, other runners, people delivering, just everyone involved. There were 96 people I'd gathered evidence against, the 6 main gangsters and 90 other people. And I remember looking at the board. You know, you've probably seen on like detective dramas and things where you've got a big whiteboard or series of them and there's like lines and faces. It's exactly like that. It is exactly like that. You have a big board and all of the connections and stuff. And I thought, wow, this is just going to sweep the town clean. This is incredible. Absolutely incredible. And all the team were excited. They had to get people on what they call mutual aid from surrounding counties to help. There were hundreds of cops involved from 5 different counties. When the dust had settled and the intel officer who was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground as to the impact of it all, he spoke to me and he says, yep, Woodsy, we've managed to interrupt the drug supply for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, being quite convinced I was going to die on multiple occasions, all of those resources, hundreds of cops, for the sake of interrupting the supply for 2 hours. Now, if you're using heroin problematically, you're not even going to be withdrawing in 2 hours before someone says, here's the new number. So that's futile, right? It's futile, but it's not just futility that was my problem that really hit me like a ton of bricks, because I had to face up to all of the doubts that I'd had. And the fact that I was justifying causing harm to these vulnerable people because, to me, the end justified the means. But clearly the end doesn't justify the means, does it? Clearly it doesn't. But it's not just the futility, it's not just the fact I was causing harm to vulnerable people. It's the fact that this constant disruption of the drug market increases the violence, because you create a big gap in that market. What happens is people jump in and compete to take advantage of that gap in the market. The opportunity in the market is probably the better word. And that means an increase in violence. So the net impact of all of those police resources is a community less safe than it was before. There have been vulnerable people manipulated and hurt, people who need help. Okay, yeah, you've put some gangsters in prison. You know, sometimes I'll say this to an audience and if there's a cop in the audience, they'll say, you shouldn't feel guilty about that. You've told us how dangerous these gangsters are. You've just told us that one of them's implicated in 7 murders. You did a good job in putting him in prison. Yeah, maybe. But where do those people come from? Where do those kids come from? Where do the gangsters, these young men prepared to do that violence, come from? Where do they come from? And that's an important question. So, if you'll forgive me, I'll refer to a job I did in Leicester a few years before that, about 3 or 4 years before. I'd been buying heroin from this gang in Highfields in Leicester. And I got to know at the start of that operation this kid, and it was the first time I bought heroin from a child. First time. 2001, it was really, really shocking and unusual to buy heroin from a child. Of course, nowadays, it's the norm. There are 50,000 children dealing heroin and crack cocaine on the streets of Britain. 50,000 now. But in 2001, it was shocking to meet this boy and him selling me heroin. He was 16, but he looked younger. But I saw that boy change from a pleasant, cheeky kid to a scary 17-year-old adult in 6 months. I saw him change because he adapted with his mates, with his gang, in order to survive in that marketplace, to become the most intimidating, to be prepared to be violent, to protect territory, to be part of a gang and have a gang ethos. I saw him change. And he wouldn't have changed otherwise. He wouldn't have changed if he hadn't been in that situation. So it's all very well to celebrate locking up these boys, these young men, but he, if he'd gone back in time maybe 3 or 4 years, he wouldn't have seen himself, his future, his ideal future, as growing up to be a violent drug-dealing gangster. There's just no way. He would have envisioned a better future, probably. But it's the market which shaped him. And it's the illicit drug market, this drug prohibition, which is changing the personality of our young men. So no, I don't think it's a victory to be catching these people.
Was it like, how quick did that happen? Was it that when they said the 2-hour thing, did it all hit you? Or was it just, what was the point that you were just like, this isn't, you were feeling things from before that you shot out, but was it a moment of clarity, or what was
it? It was a partial moment of clarity where I had to face up to the reality that this wasn't right. This is not right at all. And, from a policing perspective, I had to sort of think it through in terms of evidence, right? Because as a police officer, as a detective, you follow evidence. So I'm thinking, why are we not following evidence for the actual impact? Why is this whole thing not evidence-led? Why is it not? So I had a lot of things to think through, but it hit me like a ton of bricks, if I'm honest, but it was only a partial realization, because I hadn't come to a conclusion. Well, what am I going to do about it? What do I do? What do I do about this? And how much of it is my responsibility to do something? So I had months of thinking to go through, really, because it took me a while after that moment to realize that I actually had a duty. Because I had come to this realization, because I had these experiences, because I could evidence the reality and talk about these things, that it meant that I was duty bound to do something about it. So I had this growing pressure. Okay, if it's my duty to do something about it, what do I do? What do I do? So I tried to influence thinking within the police. That's what I tried to do to start with. And that just made me mentally ill. And that's what set me on the path to having a breakdown and eventually resigning. Because at that point, there was no changing thinking within policing.
The Burger Bar boys and like the shooting that they've been responsible for, you've just taken down what was at the time the kind of most notorious gang in the country, and then all of a sudden you're having doubts. I guess like that must have been a factor, that must have been difficult, because that's not what the bosses want, really. They want you to stand up and take the plaudits and...
Oh, no, I mean, everything I did was secret. No one knew what I'd done.
Well, but even within so if you're trying to change things from within, they weren't like, oh, because surely they were like proud of you, or pleased that everything you'd done.
Well, look, I was seen as this. I had a profile only within the little world of covert policing. I had a reputation amongst the covert drugs cops, but I couldn't tell even family or anyone what I was doing. I kept that quiet. But I had this reputation amongst.
Wait, just picking up on that a little bit. That's going through the whole time, isn't it? Actually, that's not something perhaps that I've appreciated there, which is that even when you get, you've done the amazing thing, you can't then even celebrate it or talk about it.
No, I didn't talk about it at all. No, not with colleagues, family, or anybody.
So how do you just sort of internally kind of process it? Like, how do you, after you've done a big job, what's the feeling at the end of it?
Well, we would always get together with the team, because there'd be quite a team around me. There has to be a certain model of the structure of the team. And we'd get together to have a sort of bit of a night out afterwards and say goodbye and to say, yeah, well done, everybody, that kind of thing. But other than that, just move on.
Mm. Yeah. And so anyway, talk me through the one other thing I wanted to ask you about was corruption within. Like, how often when you were doing your undercovers did you come across corruption within the police?
Well, this is another thing that added to my multi-layers of doubts, right? Because from quite early on, I had these hints of things not being quite right, of certain people getting away and various things. And then, again, these doubts sort of coalesced with the operation that I mentioned with Cammy, the Bestwood cartel, the Nottinghamshire operation. About 4.5 months into that operation, it was a really tense time because I'd been trying to get introduced to this particular guy, and 4.5 months in, I got introduced to him. And he turned up in this car with his 12-year-old son in the car. It was really weird because his 12-year-old son, bear with me, it's a long story, but I'll get there. His son was wearing an identical tracksuit, identical gold chain, identical shaved head, identical trainers, like he was like a mini me, right? And he brought his 12-year-old son with him to see what daddy does at work or something. Because when I got there, he basically interrogated me with a knife pressed into my groin, which is quite off-putting. It makes conversation quite awkward, let me put it that way. And all the time, like his son's watching, I'm like, what's daddy doing? Oh, that's what you do, is it? So the reason I set the scene with that is because that happened late at night. The next morning was a morning briefing, like an early morning briefing, where we're all gathered at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I was still up there, right? And when you've been working undercover that long and your senses are heightened, you've been through some adrenaline, you're picking up on everything. Really, really sharp senses. And two of the backup team, the team had gone off sick and 2 new cops were brought in. Now, I was not happy about this because that's not the way it's meant to work, right? You're meant to have this cell-like people who work completely separate from a police station, completely disconnected to normal policing. There's no way anyone new should be brought in at all. I wasn't happy. But anyway, I shook hands with the first one, no problem with him. Shook hands with the second one, and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. My instincts just were firing on all cylinders. I didn't trust him. So I went to the senior investigating officer, the guy running the operation. I said, look, boss, there is no way I'm going out on the streets knowing that guy knows what I'm doing. No way. I'm not doing it. And he was great. He was dead chill. He says, fine, we'll exclude them both. They've not been in the briefing. They don't know what this job's about. It's fine. So I put that out of my head. A year later, when the gangster Colin Gunn was brought down, not by my operation, but by a very detailed operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, it turned out that the cop that I'd taken exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn, the gangster. He was part of his gang, which meant that he got closer to my inner circle than I did to his, substantially more. When I'd met him, he'd been in the police for 7 years. But he wasn't corrupted while he was in the police. He was paid to join the police. And that's important to note, that he was paid to join the police. He was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. Now, his name was Charlie Fletcher, so it's all a matter of record. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Now, this, even though I'd had all of these hints of corruption, it still shocked me. But I remember being in a debrief with a senior covert cop who said, "Woodsy, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? With this much money involved, how can it not happen?" Now that's an important statement, because he's a senior covert cop. And like many senior covert cops, they understand that this is a risk and it is happening. And it's always going to happen because of the money in the drug market, right? But is this public knowledge? I think it should be public knowledge. I think the public should be informed as to what is happening to our institutions as a result of the size of this drug market. But an important thing to note, and I say this because from that moment onwards, I made it my mission in life to understand how corruption works as a result of drug policy. My absolute mission. It's important to note that it's not just the value in the drug market. It's not just the fact that there's £10 billion a year value in the drug market that causes the corruption. It's actually the attempt to police the drug market which causes the corruption. I'll explain. If you catch a drug dealer, say a heroin dealer who controls half of the supply of a city, he's up there, he controls half the supply. But you take him out, you take his gang out, the character who is most likely to be able to take over that opportunity that you've created is someone who controls the other half of the market, because they've got the resources to move in, right? Expand their operation. Where that happens, and that happens a lot, it means that someone's increased their market share. They've increased their monopoly almost. Or sometimes it means that people could form cooperatives, and that's another form of monopoly. When you get a monopoly in the drug market, it means that you're in charge of more disposable income. And if you have more disposable income, you will always invest that in corruption. Always. That's a rule within drugs organised crime. That's the way the business works. Because if you've got corrupt assets, it means that you're safer. It means you're less likely to be arrested, less likely to be prosecuted, less likely to be convicted. It means that you have an edge over your competitors. It means that you can increase your profits in various ways. So it's the most important part of the business model is corruption. And this happens all over the world. There's various examples at every level. And I mean every level. If you look at Mexico, at one time there was many drug dealing gangs in Mexico. Now there's 3 super cartels. And those super cartels have a bigger GDP than most West African countries. Wow. They do. And they use that wealth to corrupt those West African countries and other countries. So we now have increasing numbers of narco states. Senegal, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau. These are narco states. Why narco states? Well, because it's more cost effective, it's better business if you can corrupt an entire government than corrupting just individual customs officials or individual police officers. It's much more cost effective. It's much more efficient. It gives you much greater power. And this is what is happening all the time. We are looking at the destruction of the democracy of Ecuador in real time, almost on a weekly basis at the moment, with the violence in Ecuador and the way that systems, both regionally and nationally, are being destroyed by organised crime. Because Ecuador is an important country for the ports to transport cocaine. This is happening in real time. We've seen it happen in Honduras. There are regions, and this actually becomes really important for our battle with the climate crisis. Now, if you'll forgive me going off of what might seem like a tangent, but this is important. At the COPs, the climate gathering, United Nations climate gatherings, there has been in the last couple of years renewed treaties to agree to stop deforestation, right? And some of the most important countries to agree to those deforestation treaties are the countries around the equator, because the forests around the equator are more important than other forests on Earth because they are better at sequestering carbon. They're better at soaking carbon out of the atmosphere than forests near the Arctic, for example. So they're important. But it just so happens that the equator is also the most important region for the production and smuggling of three important drugs: opium, which becomes heroin, cocaine, and cannabis. And so the problem we have is that many of these equatorial countries will sign those deforestation pledges, and they will say, well, we pledge to stop the trees being cut down, but they don't control their own backyard. So those signatures are meaningless. The mafia controls the Amazon. The mafia does, not governments. The mafia controls the jungles of Colombia, of Burma. Well, in Burma, in Myanmar. I don't know why I'm using a decades-old name for a country, but in Myanmar, it's a battle between military and rebels, but it's still organised crime which controls those forests. It's the same in Cambodia. It's the same all around the world. Organised crime are in control of the most important environments to prevent climate catastrophe. Not only are they in charge of those environments, they are also in charge of the governance for those areas. So, in order to deal with the climate crisis, we need the right decisions, but most importantly, we need good governance. We need to be able to act on those decisions. But we can't, because that governance is being hollowed out by drugs organised crime. So our ability to both deal with the climate crisis and climate mitigation and climate justice is being ripped apart by the existence of drug prohibition. So this is not just, this policy of prohibition is not just causing the deaths of vulnerable people in our streets. It's not just making our communities less safe by empowering organised crime. It's not just corrupting our systems and causing corruption within our police. It's causing corruption to the point that it's preventing us as humanity actually dealing with the worst crisis we've ever faced.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that, because I went to Albania like a few months or a couple months back to do a bunch of stories, and it's such a small country, but it's like how then it has been by the same forces that you're talking about going through all those countries there. It's been impacted like that, and it connects into all this stuff you get where it's like Albanians risking their life to come over on the channel on small boats, which is driven by the, stuff that's happened in South America, and all the way that it connects into all these many different issues that we've got here. And yeah, you can link it back to these powerful kind of, say hidden forces. It's like they're not particularly hidden, but it's like, I suppose the discussion of them is not at the forefront of it.
Yeah, it's not at the forefront because we're not being honest. We're not being honest that this current policy is not working.
Where do you think that comes from? That like lack of, and just to kind of bring it back, because you're talking about when you're trying to make the impact or convince people in the police, is it just like that willingness to be in denial? Is it that, or is it something else? Or
well, it's a feedback loop, right? Because and a lot. Policing's part of the blame is partly at blame, partly because police are tasked with this policy, right? They're given these laws and they're told that you've got to act on these laws. So to a degree, the police are stuck doing that. However, they're not being honest about it. They're not being honest about the impact. So almost on a daily basis, last week we had the biggest ever seizure in the UK of cocaine, the biggest ever. Since the last time we had the biggest ever, and until the next time we have the biggest ever. These seizures are sold as success, right? All the time. The dope on the table, whether at every level, police will say, look, we've caught all these drugs. The general public sees the big pile of drugs and thinks, wow, look at that huge pile of drugs. What a great job the police have done. That must mean that the current system works. Because look, big pile of drugs. But it's without context. Because even that massive pile of cocaine last week has not had any impact on the availability of anyone's cocaine or even the price or the purity. It's that irrelevant. No one's gone without their drug of choice today or last week or any time at all. And that's what we need to be saying. The police need to be saying, well, we've seized this, but from our intelligence, it's had no impact on the market. And then the public would be informed, and then the public might have different conversations. They might say different things to their members of parliament, that actually we want a policy which makes our society safer. But we can only do that if we're being honest, and the police are not being honest. They present that they'll show an arrest of a gang, right? Big gang, and you'll see there's various images. There's the images that it's like marketing. So there's the image that we've recognised, the dope on the table, the big pile of drugs. That's one image, and it's repeated over and over and over. And that's like marketing, right? Coca-Cola will pay millions to get one can in a film because they know that image influences the public. Well, repeating this image of piles of drugs is influencing the public. It's making them believe one thing that's out of context. It's not true. Another image the police use is the row of mugshots behind the newsreader or on the front of a newspaper. Rows of mugshots, repeated. A gang's been arrested. And you'll generally find that if you've got a rows of mugshots, they're not normally white faces either, that the police are using as market what they've done. So they're telling the public, look, we've caught this gang. Look, we've caught this gang. And the public are reassured, but it's out of context. There is no truth to what they're suggesting, that this has made society safer. So all I'm asking, and not just me, and everyone from my organisation, all we're asking is for the truth. For police to actually, because the police know from their own criminal intelligence databases that they've not had any impact, and that actually more often than not, the net impact of their drugs policing as violence has gone up. They know that because they have it comes into their intelligence databases, but they keep that to themselves. That's secret. It's time to stop being secret. It's time to follow evidence, and it's time to be honest about exactly what's going on. Because what the police say feeds into media, it even feeds into drama. A dramatic story about the drug dealer. The drug dealer's always some evil person. I mean, I'm guilty of contributing to that myself, I know, with some of the stories about these scary gangsters and things. But the truth is, the vast majority of people who deal drugs are not horrible people at all. They're just people within a marketplace meeting a demand, and they do their best they can for their customers. The gangsters who supply them, okay, some of those have learnt to be violent, but most people, it's just mates dealing to each other.
Do you think part of it, like obviously county lines, that's become like a big thing in the last decade and what have you, and a lot of people see, particularly if they're in a small town, they see drug use, the drug trade, and the big thing that now the police have been pushing, I'd be interested to get your take on this, is the sort of antisocial impact or the additional crime impact that happens. That's how it kind of gets sold now, because it's like, okay, we're going to run an operation to take down this county lines gang because of, it's not just the drugs, it's the kind of, you don't feel safe to walk down the street. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, the important message really that needs to get out there is the county lines, that's my fault. That's my fault. We've got kids dealing heroin and crack now because of people like me, because we were really good at catching the adults. So the adults have adapted by exploiting children. That's the net effect of drugs policing, of police tactics. It's the logical, tactical response to police success. So we've caused this. As I said, in 2001, I was shocked to buy heroin from a child. Now it's not shocking, it's everywhere. You've got to look back and realise what's caused it. Nothing else has caused it. If you were to go back, when we surrendered control of heroin to organised crime at the beginning of the 1970s, if you were to go back in time and speak to a heroin dealer, an adult heroin dealer, and say, in a few decades' time, your trade will be exploiting children to deal that, he says, no, No way, he'd say. No way will that ever happen because we've got ethics. But things have changed because organised crime has adapted to what the police do. So we have to be honest about it. You know, it's not happened in isolation. It's not just happened because some people are evil and they like to exploit children. And this antisocial behaviour, well, look, if you teach, if you exploit, if you groom and exploit children to deal heroin and crack cocaine, you're going to change the behaviour of those children. And that will have an influence on their peers. Violent, intimidating behaviour becomes normal within a peer group because you've got those influences sitting within that peer group. That changes the dynamic of how young people behave. It changes the dynamic of how and where they feel safe because there are these more violent elements now within their peer groups or on the periphery of their peer groups. So then it becomes more normal to carry knives. So then it becomes more normal to develop ways of standing up to bullies and how you behave. Or it means that you have to adapt and have a friendship group where you feel supported. This whole thing is changing the way our young people behave and the pressures that they're under. So, antisocial behaviour. Yeah. Is policing the answer for that? For something that's been caused by a policing response?
When you, so you obviously go out and you must encounter police. I can only imagine that they react pretty strongly to the suggestion. When you're saying I've done this, weren't being part of the police, I imagine that. Tell me about some of those interactions that you have, or do they come? They must be angry with what you're saying, or they reject it.
No, there are many, many smart cops.
I don't want to generalise, but
no. Well, no, it's a fair question. I mean, look, the police are divided into. A friend of mine, Nick Crofts, he says you're always going to get cops divided into thirds. There's a third who are just going to say, no, you're wrong. It just needs tougher policing, and it's not my fault. It's not down to me to interpret it any more than that. And then you've got the third on the other side of the spectrum who recognise what you say. They're very responsive to it, and they wonder what they can do about it. And then you've got the third in the middle who are you can possibly influence. And the cops who understand this in numbers are growing rapidly all over the world. And that's partly because of the leadership of my organisation. We're growing around the world. And police leadership, there's been some brilliant police leaders, some really good ones in the UK who recognise these realities, who want to change policing practices as best they can, within their limits that they can, to actually do things differently. Unfortunately, politics limits what some cops can do, but what I can say is that police leadership in the UK and in many countries is way ahead of politics. They understand this way better than politicians. For example, in Police Scotland, all of the police now carry naloxone. All of them. And that took a real cultural change and brave leadership from the cops in Scotland to do that. Naloxone is an antidote for a heroin overdose. Every single cop carries it. When that was proposed, the Police Federation, which is like the police union, completely opposed it. The Police Federation even tried to boycott the training. But now even the Federation has been brought on as well. So in terms of attitude and understanding the impact of our current drug policy, there are brilliant police leaders, but they're limited by the politics. I am in conversation with many people who teach police in various places. I have spoken for those courses, both the University of Law and various other universities, So we are in the classroom and we are talking to many cops who understand this very, very well. In the United States, the membership of LEAP, which is the organisation to which I belong, is much bigger than here, and the movement's growing rapidly there as well.
Interesting with the politics side of it, because obviously that is the thing of going on, politicians want to go on those raids and be next to the big piles of drugs and whatever that are coming up. Do you think that it's part of like the short-termism that you get within that? And also, I mean, I don't want to go down too much of a different path here, but a bit of hypocrisy, because like drug use within politics, within that, like how they see it and what they're doing in their own private lives means that, like, you know, there's a willingness to just sort of embrace the ineffectiveness of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The short-termism, I mean, some nations are worse than others for that, although it always exists in most places, politics. Unfortunately, in the UK, that short-termism and populist messaging has become a real problem in our politics, I think. But drug policy has always been a political football. It's always been a way of attacking the opposition without substance. In the 2015, I think it's the 2015 elections, Labour did some terrible leaflets attacking the Lib Dems. And this leaflet just said, Lib Dems, soft on drugs. And they did millions of these leaflets to attack the Lib Dems. Some very ethical MPs that I know within Labour refused to use them, refused to have them sent out to their team to use those leaflets, because that really was the lowest common denominator and it was just the wrong thing to do. But each party at some point has been guilty of using drug policy just as a way to try and bash the opposition, which is horrific, really, when you realise that we've got the highest drug deaths in Europe. They're literally playing with people's lives here. Instead of taking a responsible approach to adopt the best policies to save lives, they're using it as cheap political point scoring. And I can't forgive that. It's appalling. You know, there are literally vulnerable people dying in this country and no apparent will to do much about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just going back to kind of one of the things you mentioned at the beginning, which is like talking about like tabloid stories about crack coming over. Like, I can see, as soon as you said that, immediately came to my mind, which is everything that we've got at the moment about fentanyl and synthetic opioids coming over. And it's, I mean, I don't know because I can't remember it, but like from what you're saying, it's the exact same thing of there's these new killer drugs from America and they're on our streets and they're turning people into zombies and they're turning people into, you know, like rotting people's bodies and making them go wild and all the rest of this stuff. I guess like when you see all of that stuff, like how do you, you know, like, is it like how, and everything you're fighting to try and does it dishearten you? Does it kind of like that you're recognizing these same patterns just repeating themselves?
Yeah, it is dismaying, especially, I mean, you mentioned the zombie word, and zombie is an example of many different words which are used within press to dehumanize people. Because if you're describing someone as a zombie, you're literally describing them as other than human. And this is a common thing, a common description of people who are using drugs problematically. Instead of using that sort of moral judgment and dehumanizing language, we should be thinking, what happened to you? What happened to you? Because when someone has got themselves into a state where they're using drugs problematically, they're responding to something that's been done to them more often than not. So it does dismay me. It's the choice of language dismays me, and the way that it's looked at really does. And these constant moral panics, you know, because it's so unhelpful, because that's what feeds into this feedback loop. You know, politicians hear the public talking about it. The politicians respond with a get tough rhetoric. This is further fueled by the police showing big seizures of drugs. And it's just feeding in all the time. We just need to stop. Take a step back and have a look at actually what's happening here. Why are people using drugs problematically? Why have we got this mess? Why are organised crime so powerful? It's policy. You know, this policy that we're stuck in has done this and is making things worse in real time. Now, you mentioned the synthetic opioids. The Taliban have probably successfully reduced the opium supply by about 90%, which means, that doesn't mean no one's going to be without their drug of choice. It means that their drug of choice is going to become more dangerous. That's the reason we're going to have more nitazines and other synthetic opioids, maybe even fentanyl, coming into the UK. It's why we're starting to get it now. Because organised crime are still going to keep trading. They'll just go synthetic. If they haven't got the plant, they just go synthetic. So the lesson here is you cannot stop the drug supply. Policing drugs does not work. It just makes it more dangerous and people are more likely to die. Whereas, if we took legal control, you can save lives and take the power away from organised crime.
It's really interesting because I did a story about synthetics coming into the drug supply, and the area that we're specifically looking at was East London. And I spoke to loads of different drug dealers for it to be like, what's going on with these synthetics? And everyone knew that they were there, but what it boiled down to in terms of like why they were there or why, and actually interesting, speaking to a lot of the users, they were saying, oh, I have to buy from this guy, or I'm taking crack, but it's having the same effect as what someone that's withdrawing from an opioid is. And what the kind of conclusion or the consensus that it came to was, it was a canny business decision by whoever was like, you know what, let's just put a bit of these synthetics in here. Oh, and we'll put a bit in the crack as well, because it's then, well, we're getting the customers, they then come to me. And in this, the area that we're talking about, it was there's a lot of other options in the marketplace. And it comes back to that thing about, well, what was driving the synthetics to come in, which were doing horrible things to people's legs kind of like rotting away, and but all the things, like the other elements that end up in there. And it came down to that, like the business part of it, the money, that it was like,
yeah, that's true. It is the business and the money, and also bear in mind that a little bit further up the chain, the thing about synthetic is they're stronger by weight, right? So if something is stronger by weight, it's easier to smuggle. So it becomes more cost effective to smuggle. So over time, the stronger drugs dominate the market. It's called the iron law of prohibition, that the commodity will always become more dangerous, especially as these nitrazines or other synthetic opioids become cheaper and more available, which of course they will, because the market adapts. But there's something worth noting here as well, though, that what increases the likelihood of overdoses happening is actually police activity. And we now have an academic study from the United States which proves that. Now, we've been saying this, our organisation's been saying this for years, that not only do you increase violence, you're actually more likely to cause overdoses. Because if you disrupt people's supply, they have to go to a new dealer they're not used to. And the new dealer thinks, I can make some money off these new customers. We've said for years this increases the likelihood of people dying, a direct consequence of police raids. But we now have a study from a professor called Brandon Del Pozo at Brown's University in the United States, which studied the impact of police raids in the opioid market. And the inescapable conclusion is that overdoses go up. Police do the raids, arrest people, overdoses go up. Now, we know that now. That should be enough information to say, stop. Stop. That information itself, hang on, we're increasing the chance of death. You've got to stop. You've got to reevaluate. You've got to do something different. But it's not stopped. Now, at the beginning of our conversation, near the beginning, I said, you asked me about when things happened that I was unsure about. Something happened and I described an instance where someone was hit. And I made the point that working undercover, my duty always remained the same. And the first duty is the preservation of life. That doesn't change, whatever job you're doing in the police. So, with the evidence being available that drugs policing is actually increasing the risk to life, where does our duty stand? We're ignoring our duty. Collectively, police are not following their first duty. As a society, we should have the same duty. We're not doing the same.
In terms of your organisation and what you campaign for, you just to understand it and be clear, what you want is Because people would think about it as legalization, but you're keen to describe it as control.
Yeah, because look, the word legalization is very unfortunate. It's become a word which conjures this idea, this bizarre idea, that we're advocating for a free-for-all and making it easier for people to get drugs and do whatever they want. No, we're advocating the opposite. The situation at the moment is out of control. The situation at the moment is the Wild West. What we're talking about is taking back control. So we're talking about legal regulation. Now, we're good at regulating stuff in this country, really good. Everything's regulated. Plastic bags are regulated, with warnings for children. Food is regulated. Everything we do, seatbelts in cars, we're really good at it. We work out the safest way of protecting people and advising people. We do it for alcohol. You can only buy alcohol in set measures and certain amounts, and for a spirit, it's 1 measure or 2 measures or whatever. We've developed this over time by following the best evidence and resisting the influence of alcohol companies as well, of course. We've got tobacco regulation which protects children. That's what we're advocating for. And the evidence is clear that regulation works. So for the states that have legalised cannabis in the United States, where they've got legal regulation for adult consumption of cannabis, underage consumption has gone down in every single one of those states. There are less children using the drug because the drug is legal, because the supply is regulated, because dealers don't ask for ID. But a regulated store has to ask for ID, right? So you're restricting the amount of access children have to that drug. Regulation protects children better than prohibition does. If you look at opioids, we used to regulate heroin in this country. Up until the end of the 1960s, if you developed a problem with heroin, you went to a doctor and you got prescribed clean, safe heroin from the doctor. A pragmatic response to an unfortunate medical condition is the way it used to be seen. It was called the British system. The British system was destroyed by American foreign policy. They didn't like it. So now we have the system we have now, where heroin is dealt with by police. At the end of the British system, in the 1960s, there were only 1,046 people using heroin in the UK. 1,046. In less than 15 years, that went up to 300,000. We had our heroin epidemic. A very clear cause and effect, because the market was handed to organised crime, who want to find new customers, right? It's a business interest for them. And that's how we got the heroin epidemic. That's the journey which has now led us to having 50,000 children dealing heroin. It doesn't happen in legal markets. It didn't happen in the British system and never would have done. Never would have done. So regulation for different drugs means a different thing. For the more dangerous drugs like heroin's the easiest, actually. You have a medical model where you look after people who developed an addiction. And what's sickening is that other countries have taken British evidence. So in 1994, Switzerland adopted the British system. They used British evidence to inform their heroin policy. And now they don't have a heroin problem. They don't have one. Because they took control of the supply in 1994. There's no children dealing heroin in Switzerland, nor will there ever be. Because they use the British system. For the other drugs, we need to regulate according to the risks of those drugs. Carefully, very carefully, according to the relative risks. MDMA should be a fairly simple one, really. We know that the adult dose is around 0.120 of a gram, 120 milligrams. Whereas you get pills in the unregulated illegal market, which are 350 milligrams, 400 milligrams. So all of the deaths and problems that have happened from MDMA has been because it's not regulated. So you regulate it. And, for MDMA, because we have this sort of lie, this false idea amongst the public that any drug consumption is an addiction. If you're taking drugs, you're addicted to it. The average number of people the average number of times someone who consumes MDMA does so in 1 year. 3.5 times. 3.5 times. You don't really find people addicted to MDMA. It's just something that people do on a special occasion, a music event or a festival, something like that. Do we really need to be making that a Class A drug and criminalising people? No, we need to be making sure that people are doing it safely. Do we really care that people take MDMA and dance to electronic music in a field? Do we? We need to be asking ourselves these questions. Or do we care that they're safe? Do we want them to survive that experience and not be harmed by it? These are simple questions we need to be asking. And the answer to those questions is always legal control, legal regulation. Yeah, so if people want to know more about my life working undercover, I have written a book. It's called Good Cop, Bad War. And if people want to know about the history of drug policy in the UK, the British system, that's my second book. I've written with the brilliant J.S. Raffaeli, and that's called Drug Wars. If people want to know more about the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, the organisation to which I'm a part, then they can look at the website in the USA or the European websites. And if they want to support LEAP, then get in touch with me and I'll tell you how.
Brilliant. You've been watching On the Edge. Many thanks to Neil for coming on and sharing some incredible experiences. Remember, if you want more stories like this, to like, follow and subscribe. Thanks and see you next time.